The People of the Secret. Chapter 6. Alchemy. What is alchemy? Half a century ago, there was little doubt in the West. It was a superstition among ignorant ancients that by certain manipulations, base metals could be turned into gold. Then, when Freudian and Jungian ideas began to circulate in Europe, a new enlightened view of alchemy became fashionable. Alchemy, it was now said, was really human psychology. The alchemists were psychoanalyzing themselves. They were sublimating and calcining their own subconscious. Their real aim was not to make gold, but to make a non-aberrated man. As pursuits of this kind in the Middle Ages overlapped territory which the Church held to be its own, the alchemists had been obliged to conceal what they were really doing behind an apparently lunatic attempt to turn lead into gold. Even for the new psychological avant-garde, this explanation was not entirely satisfactory because it was well known that even in the 20th century, highly intelligent men in Fez, Krakow, Damascus, Paris and London were currently engaged in attempts to make perfectly tangible yellow gold. They had given up charcoal furnaces and were using Kala gas, but they were manifestly doing something with pots and pans, and not with egos and ids. Perhaps all external ideas about the nature of alchemy could be put into 4 views, separately or in combination. First view, it is possible to transmute one element into another. One such transmutation is lead or iron into gold. From some unimaginable antiquity, a mighty secret has been handed down, which shows how to do this. It is the most closely kept secret in human history. Second view, alchemy is the science of purifying man's inner nature and arriving at a non-aberrated individual. Such an individual would have, by comparison with ordinary men, certain advanced powers. For political reasons, this exercise had to be concealed in a pseudo-science of metal refining to which the Church would have no reason to object. Third view, metals can be transmuted. Lead can be turned into gold. An alchemist knows how to do this, and also knows a greater secret. If he is in a certain relation to the crucible in which the process happens, a comparable transmutation takes place in his own common presence. As lead turns into gold in the crucible, the operator's mind is transformed. He is subjected to something like nuclear radiation. Also, certain chemical byproducts in the crucible are capable of being stored and used either to make more gold or to transform other men. Hence legends of the sly man's pill, and the elixir which Saint-Germain is supposed to have offered Casanova when he was dying. Fourth view, an alchemist is a man who knows an immensely powerful method of cleaning the Augean stable of his own subconscious mind. Pushed far enough, this process gives rise to a true soul body, inholding the properties of a different order of things. If this soul body is directed on the base metals in a certain way, projection, it will accomplish a comparable transmutation in inorganic matter. It should be said at once that no one outside the select circle of successful alchemists, if there are such, knows which of these, separately or in combination, approximates to the truth, but some hint may be contained in the first article of the Hermetic Declaration, the emerald tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. True it is, without falsehood, certain and most true. That which is above is as that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above, to accomplish the miracle of one thing. Whether as a quick way to a fortune, as a process of psychological development, or as a holy science of soul-making, alchemy captured the imagination of Europe for centuries, and at certain levels does so still, though in such circles there is now a widespread belief that there has been an interdict upon the complete operation since about the end of the 18th century. There are reasons to believe, however, that occasional breakthroughs still occur. Alchemy may be derived from the Arabic alchemia. The allegedly Egyptian origins of the art suggest that the chem root may come from the Egyptian name for Egypt, meaning black, referring to the black soil which distinguished it from the desert sand. It may also come from the Greek word for fusing. Alchemy, at any rate, is of great antiquity, whether credit for the first historical record should go to China or Egypt. There are records of Chinese alchemy or anti-alchemy laws in 144 BC, and some reason to predate Chinese alchemy to the 4th century BC at least. There were considerable exchanges between the Far and Near East. and Middle Eastern alchemy may well have come from China. On the other hand, Chinese alchemy was very largely esoteric and concerned with producing a medicine to give long life or immortality. Middle Eastern alchemy prior to Islam had a preponderantly exoteric reputation and was seemingly concerned to manipulate metallic alloys. It has been pointed out that if China transmitted the idea of alchemy, it would have been an alchemy of medicine and not of metallurgy. If, however, we take the viewpoint that alchemy is the translation into material terms of information about non-causal events obtained through access to higher consciousness, there is no historical difficulty. Both sources, Chinese and Middle Eastern, would penetrate to the same insights, but would translate them into whatever material terms appeal to their own psychology. In one case, medical, in another metallic, in a third, a combination of both. Almost from the foundation of Islam, alchemy became a Muslim science, though Holmyard makes the point that this is true only linguistically. Arabic was the cultural language of the Islamic empires and therefore the language of art and science. The texts dealt with might, however, be in any language. Persian and Greek, for example, listing Stephanos, Apollonius, Archelaus, and others, Holmyard says, Islam appropriated Greek alchemical authorities in toto. Certainly, it would seem that Islam was the agent for reissuing a great amount of alchemical work from a much more remote past, but that, in addition, the Arab alchemists made their own highly original contributions. The first translation of alchemical texts, from Greek and Coptic, are said to have been made on the order of Khalid, son of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid I, in the first half-century following the death of Muhammad. Armed with these translations, the young Khalid studied the subject at Damascus under Maurianus, said to be a Christian monk of Alexandria. The Nestorian Christians at this time were celebrated for their work in assisting translation of past knowledge into Arabic, but this was a transition phase of Saracenic development. By the 8th century, the Arabs had produced a wide range of scholars able to read Greek. After this, the transmission of past learning became rapid. In alchemy, this phase is associated with the name of Jabir ibn Hayyan, otherwise Geber. His style of writing, intended to enlighten those who already possessed the key to alchemy, while remaining exasperatingly obscure to those who did not, became known as the Geber style and gave the word gibberish to the English language. Jabir was an orphan whose father Hayyan was beheaded for instigating revolt against the Umayyad dynasty. In consequence, the boy was befriended by the Shiite faction. Little is known about his early life except that his master was a scholar called Habi al-Himyari. Jabir appears as a fully fledged alchemist at the court of Harun al-Rashid. His protector was the Shiite imam, Jafar al-Sadiq. Accounts exist of Jabir curing one of the ladies of the court with a certain elixir, so it is clear that the medical aspect of alchemy associated with the Chinese stream was known to the Arab alchemists by the second half of the 8th century. Jabir was a scholar of great range. As well as books on alchemy, he wrote papers on astronomy, logic, medicine, automata and magic squares, some of which were translated in Spain by Gerard of Cremona. Coded material seems to be inseparable from these magic squares, and it is possible that matters concerned with the rival factions claiming the true mandate of the prophet are involved in these cipher puzzles, as well as material deriving from the objective science of alchemy. Considering the nature of the material deriving from Muhammad, it may be that the two aspects are inseparable. Scholars dispute the attribution of much of the Jabirian corpus to Jabir, but it seems clear that he was the author of much of it, though his texts were probably expanded or even slanted by the Ishmaelite sect in the 10th century. For reasons connected with the double streams of occultism and politics, which are apparently inseparable from this tradition. Jabir's ground plan of nature involved 4 basic elements: earth, air, fire, and water, in line with Aristotelian belief, but he developed these in terms of hotness, coldness, dryness, and moisture. In the presence of these qualities and under planetary influences, metals were formed in the earth by the action of sulfur and mercury. Holmyard feels that this represents Jabir's major contribution to alchemy, and that it influenced the development of experimental chemistry till the 17th century. Holmyard, perhaps as a result of a visit to an alchemical laboratory at Fez, appears to have more than a purely academic attitude, and notes that when Jabir wrote sulfur, he meant sulfur. Holmyard almost makes a leap into the mystical background of alchemy when he writes these were hypothetical substances to which ordinary sulfur and mercury formed the closest available approximation. Perhaps interesting comparisons with the hydrogens of G.I. Gurdjieff might also be made. The combination of mercury and sulfur, absolutely pure and in a certain proportion, give rise, Jabir believed, to gold. In various degrees of impurity and in various proportions, they give rise to all the other metals. One of Jabir's apparent endeavors was to arrive at a formula which would give the various balances. One such table, which he published, turns out to be a magic square, which was known to the Neoplatonists and, says Holmyard, had associations for the Sufi mystical society of which he was a member. And there we have it. Jabir was not an Arab with a bee in his bonnet about naive chemistry and magic squares. He was a Sufi. The most open-minded scholars are continually baffled by a certain seeming incongruity. Throughout history, men who are clearly intellectuals and who have, from internal evidence of their work, a high IQ, are associated with what appear to be childish pursuits. They draw magic squares and fuse metals in bowls, trying to manufacture gold. It is a disquieting picture, rather like coming upon Einstein seriously trying to get nuclear fission with a magnifying glass. Yet the contradiction would seem to resolve when viewed against the background of all alchemical pursuits, which is clearly mysticism. Jabir, reputed to be the greatest alchemist since Hermes, is a Sufi. He is associated with a technique of entering a different kind of consciousness. He has, in consequence, access to an inductive and not a deductive method. Instead of observing the results of experiment and deducing the laws which apply, he observes the laws in operation at noumenal level and induces their experimental application. Since there is no everyday knowledge of such a process, there is no ordinary vocabulary to describe it. The alchemist is reduced to talking about sulfur and mercury and elixir and stone. If he lives at a time when there are no inverted commas, he cannot easily suggest the symbolic nature of these terms. At the same time, there are many alchemical authorities who appear, from internal evidence, to be fully knowledgeable, yet who deny completely that the transmutation of metals, and hence gold-making in the ordinary sense, is possible at all. One such was Abu Ali ibn Sina, whose name was westernized to Avicenna. He was regarded as the greatest intellect since Aristotle, and for centuries the medieval world regarded him as a genius, whose word upon any subject was final. A famous work on minerals, long attributed to Aristotle himself, was discovered in 1927 to be a condensation of one of Avicenna's books. Now Avicenna held the same basic ideas as did Jabir about the constitution of matter, but he went out of his way to assert that transmutation of minerals, and hence gold-making, was an old wives' tale. There are several possible explanations. The first is that men of exceptional intellect, working pragmatically, arrived at certain conclusions by deduction from experiment. Such men would be in effect materialist scientists before their time. The second is that certain exceptional individuals associated with genuine schools of human development added to the sum of the practical knowledge of their time because they had access to higher consciousness and could induce the application of natural laws to practical events. The third is that men of this latter category chose to conceal the source of their knowledge by deliberate misdirection. The Sufic tradition appears to contain many examples of this, and it is said that reality can sometimes be best approximated at temporal level in terms of apparently irreconcilable opposites. It is necessary to note that opposite things work together even though nominally opposed, said the great Sufic sage Rumi. Both Rumi, died 1273, and El-Ghazali in the 11-12 centuries, acknowledged Sufi giant, referred to mystical knowledge as alchemical transformation. Holmyard makes the point that alchemy, like printing, reached its highest pitch of perfection while still in its infancy, an observation in line with Rodney Collins' theory of cellular development. Islamic alchemy, says Holmyard, never surpassed the level it attained with one of its earliest exponents, Jabir ibn Hayyan. Certainly an enormous amount of all subsequent alchemy in Europe derived from the Latin translations, in various degrees corrupted, made from the Jabir alchemical corpus, so from Egypt to Greece, to Islam to Europe. The great transition to modern times took place after 1100 and was centered round the famous College of Translators at Toledo, founded by Archbishop Raymond. Robert of Chester, collaborating with another student translator, Herman of Dalmatia, undertook to translate the Quran at the request of Peter the Venerable, who was a Cluniac. When they had finished this, it took 2 years. Robert of Chester then began the translation of an Arab treatise, the Book of the Composition of Alchemy. He recorded the completion of this task on February 11th, 1144, so that the literary date of this alchemy passing into Europe is known precisely. Chester noted that no Latin words existed corresponding to some of the Arabic alchemical vocabulary, and he was forced to use simple transliterations. In this way, many words like alkali, alcohol, athanor, elixir, matras, and naphtha passed from Arabic into Western European languages. Adelard of Bath translated another alchemical text, and Gerard did several from the Greek, one by Razi, and very probably the Book of 70 by Jabir. The mystery of the alchemical process was now about to engage the whole of Europe, and this it proceeded to do in the 12th and 13th centuries. Among the first of the European alchemists was Albertus Magnus. Albert, Count of Bolstadt, 1206 to 1280, was the prototype of many strange figures of the Middle Ages who combined an eager, questing intellect together with a certain something, which served to earn them election to the mysterious company of secret people. He refused to believe that knowledge ended with Aristotle and insisted on the primacy of personal observation and experiment, whatever ancient texts had to say. He is the first Christian who is prepared to accept a rational treatment of natural phenomena. A Dominican monk, in spite of his independent mind, he traveled all over France and Germany on foot, lecturing on philosophy before finally returning to Cologne to study and write in seclusion. Albert was one of these apparently ambivalent intellects, which are such a sore trial to the logical mind. He seems to have asserted on the one hand that the alchemical transmutation of metals was impossible, and that alchemists succeeded only in dyeing metals to look like gold. In another book attributed to him, he declares a subjective insight into the alchemical process given him by the grace of God, and goes on to describe recipes for performing transmutations. Albert's fame was such that young scholars came from all over Europe to get his teaching. One such, and the most famous of all, was Thomas Aquinas. Whatever is to be made of his apparently contradictory views on alchemy, Albertus was no simple pragmatist. Legend associates him not only with constructing one of these famous talking heads, but with making an entire artificial man, a task which occupied him for 30 years. As Idries Shah has disclosed, making a head is a dervish code phrase for a certain exercise of inner development, and it is inconceivable that such a legend should have attached to a man who was not, alchemically speaking, on the inside. That he possessed other powers associated with a level of development beyond the ordinary, instantaneous hypnotism, for example, is suggested in another legend. He is said to have invited a royal party to a banquet in midwinter and then proposed holding it in the open air. Suddenly the royal guests saw the snow disappear. The sun came out, the trees were covered in foliage, the grass became midsummer green, and fruit appeared on the bushes. As soon as the banquet was over, the sylvan scene vanished, and the party found themselves shivering in the winter cold. Clearly, Albertus had the practice as well as the theory. That there was a network of transmission behind the scenes so that knowledgeable people, whether clerics or laymen, could contact one another, may be suggested by the family circumstances of Albert's greatest pupil, Thomas, later St. Thomas Aquinas. To glimpse this, it will be necessary to flash back briefly to a strange little empire in the Mediterranean, where a whole world, largely unsuspected by the rest of Europe, continued to inject apparently alien standards into European history. In the 11th century, armies on the way home from the Crusades began to take part in the struggle for power in southern Italy. Some of them, under Tancred de Hauteville, conquered part of South Italy and took Sicily from the Saracens. Out of this operation grew a royal dynasty, with Roger II established as the monarch of a combined kingdom of Apulia and Sicily. This court was a strange mixture of the cultured and the barbaric, of East and West, of Christianity and Islam. Half European, half Oriental, it had a combined tradition of Greek, Latin, Moor and Jew. Roger kept a harem and had eunuchs. A daughter of Roger II married the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, and had a son, Frederick. The office of emperor was elective, but with the support of Innocent III, the young Frederick was elected emperor as Frederick II. As the Sicilian kingdom was hereditary, Frederick became both emperor and king of Sicily. The Pope's support for Frederick had been conditional on his mounting a sixth crusade. Frederick promised, but never quite got round to it. A later Pope, Gregory IX, excommunicated him and invaded his domains in South Italy. Frederick sailed for the Holy Land, but had an interview with the Sultan of Egypt, as a result of which it was agreed that Christian pilgrims should have access to the holy places for 10 years. Frederick apparently achieved as much in 10 minutes as all the Crusades put together. H.G. Wells regards this interlude as an outstanding example of simple commercial sanity in an era of supercharged religious emotion. Frederick much preferred his Sicilian court to his German one. An amazingly well-educated man, he spoke 6 languages, including fluent Arabic, and he gathered round him philosophers of all persuasions. Among his court scholars was Michael Scott, who translated both Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Aristotle. From the court of Frederick, it is claimed, Arabic numerals entered the West. Called by his contemporaries the wonder of the world, Frederick was an astonishing mixture of scientist, philosopher, linguist, traveller, and sybarite. He was a patron of the arts, valued beauty for itself, and was apparently interested in everything. In 1224, he founded the University of Naples, the first secular university in Europe, and he enlarged the medical school at Salerno. For light relief, he founded a zoological garden. When the Provençal troubadours were fleeing from the Albigensian terror, he set up a refuge for them. From this grew a Sicilian school of poetry, which later spread north. Out of it, it is claimed, grew the poetry of Dante. Frederick himself was a poet in the Italian vernacular. It is fairly clear that Frederick was engaged in enterprises which went deeper than appearances. The Saracenic empires were undoubtedly the cover for the Sufic operation into Europe, by which certain evolutionary gains were being attempted, and the hidden inner activity spilled over into many forms. Whether Frederick was knowledgeable about the inner processes working through the history of the time, it is impossible to say, but some indication may be glimpsed from the fact that when building castles in southern Italy, for example, Castel del Monte in Apulia, these were designed as perfect octagons. This, says one historian, was a non-functional design, and must therefore have been purely aesthetic. Those who have noticed the recurrence of the octagon motif in various connections may suspect that it was not aesthetic at all. The strange and haunting legend of Barbarossa, the monarch who sleeps in a deep cavern, his beard growing round a stone table, and who will awaken when the time is right for him to restore peace in a disordered world. This legend is normally ascribed to Frederick I. H.G. Wells suggests that the legend should rightly be attached to Frederick II, and that it was subsequently antedated to enhance the religious prestige of the Crusader, Frederick I. If, as Wells suggests, the legend of Barbarossa should properly refer to Frederick II, some interesting speculations arise. The legend of the great figure who sleeps till an appointed time has counterparts in Egyptian legend. In the story of Melchizedek, of Arthur, Merlin, Rip Van Winkle, and perhaps the Wandering Jew. That a legend of such an obviously archetypal nature should attach to a man who exhibited the qualities of Frederick II and who built octagonal castles for no apparent reason is interesting indeed. Was the influence of Frederick II purely local, a quixotic injection of alien Oriental ideas which startled Western Christendom as a 9 days wonder and then faded out of history? Or did his influence later emerge in underground and unsuspected ways? One of the major influences on medieval Christianity was undoubtedly Thomas Aquinas, whose orthodox piety incorporated a resolute attempt to reinstate reason as a legitimate component of religious faith. His efforts made an impression on church dogmatism, from which perhaps modern attitudes of thought became possible. Was it coincidence, therefore, that Thomas's family had distinguished themselves in the service of Frederick II? Or that after an elementary education at Monte Cassino, he went to the university that Frederick had set up? Or that Thomas found his teacher in the person of Albertus Magnus, who was clearly involved in activities which were not discernible on the surface? It seems likely that certain influences from the court of Frederick II were well known in Thomas's family, and that he was destined for the role he had to play. A not dissimilar family link may also be suspected in the career of Raymond Lully, who, so far, has just failed to attain the award of canonization accorded to Aquinas. Thomas went from Frederick's University at Naples, where his masters were Peter the Irishman and Martin of Denmark, to become a Dominican monk, a move of which apparently his family disapproved. This may, however, have facilitated his meeting with Albertus at Cologne. For the 3 years subsequent to 1245, Thomas studied under Albertus and emerged a philosopher and an alchemist. He then went to Paris, where in 1256 he was admitted as Master of Paris University. This appointment brought to a head the clash between the alchemist scholars and the Church. One of Thomas's aims was to correlate all known learning of his day, an aim which has a familiar ring against the tradition which includes the encyclopedists of Basra and Roger Bacon. Reason and faith, he claimed, were both concerned with the same object. The former starts with sense data and attains to a knowledge of the existence, goodness, and will of God. The latter rests on revelation. Each requires to take into account the knowledge arrived at by the other. The Church now took its stand. Rationalism, it was felt, had gone far enough. Thomas's writings were condemned by various European churchmen, including the Bishop of Paris and 2 successive archbishops of Canterbury. Their objection largely centered on Thomas's view of the human soul as a single substantial form of the human body, a view which apparently represented an attack on an article of faith. The fight, however, was really between Aristotle and Rome. Aristotle had been regarded as an almost superhuman authority, so long as he was known only in Greek. When his thinking became available in Arabic and, through the translators and the alchemist scholars, in Latin, his system was suddenly seen to be a self-sufficient cosmology that did not require Christianity. The alarm bells rang. Thomas apparently believed in the reality of alchemical transmutation, but his attitude contained an interesting factor not much hinted at before his day. The great work, he believed, was dependent on a celestial virtue, which was not always at the alchemist's command, and part of the alchemist's task was to arrange conditions under which this virtue would be most likely to function. An echo of this idea appears in our own day in the analysis of alchemy from external sources made by Pauwels and Bergier. Here it is conjectured that the alchemical process, whether related to the inner development of man or the transmutation of metals, is dependent upon some seemingly arbitrary factor, which the authors suggest may be the intensity of cosmic rays at a particular place and time. It may be that Pauwels and Bergier have an insight here, though their identification of the arbitrary factor with cosmic rays may be fanciful. It is significant that initiate tradition in the Sufi stream insists that certain operations, though the procedures may be correct, will be effective, or as they say, developmental, only under a combination of circumstances which they summarize as right effort by the right people at the right time and the right place. In the absence of these conditions, there is no occasion. Whatever reality is concealed in this formula, it would explain recurring references throughout the whole of alchemical literature to an intangible which many alchemists were never able to find, and in the absence of which their efforts were endlessly vain. Both Albertus and Thomas Aquinas were engaged, it seems, in a perilous exercise of hunting with hounds and running with hares. They probably knew, because of their contact with a genuine esoteric source, that known truth and theological dogma need not by any means coincide. They were probably engaged in trying to reintroduce the original developmental force of Christianity, while gently diluting the organizational accretions which had all but smothered it. They tried, as a beginning, to show that rationalism and intuitive insights could be harmonized with theology. Historically, it would seem that the effort failed. Yet behind the scenes, much must have been achieved. There is evidence that at the deepest levels of Sufi secrecy, there is a mutual communication with the mystics of the Christian West, says Idries Shah. This behind-the-scenes communication is being increasingly recognized by modern Arabists and other scholars, but they tend to interpret the discovery so as to square with prior assumptions. They now incline to the view that there was something behind the scenes, and that it was good, but they think this was so because of the effect of Christianity on the expositors of the ancient teachings. The discovery that Christian contemplatives used Sufi books, Sufi methods, and Sufi terminology has stimulated the inevitable results. Sufism, it is now declared, is able to produce true mystical experience because the Sufis revere Jesus. Further, Sufism was profoundly influenced in its early days by Christianity. The implication is that Sufi ideas are not to be rejected. If St. John of the Cross and Lully could use them, there must be some good in them. The scholastics have retraced a part of their path and are rewriting their history to allow for uncomfortable facts. If men like Albertus and Thomas were in touch with some aspect of the directorate, they would have the effect required on their contemporaries and their environment, and it is impossible, therefore, to judge their success or otherwise from externals. Much was certainly achieved. The developmental secret hinted at by the alchemists was incorporated in many media, from folk practices to art and architecture. The true nature of the Gothic cathedrals as textbooks of human alchemy was suggested in many ways. The idea that a whole stupendous spiritual reality existed behind the veil of everyday life was carefully injected by the few who knew. It continued to be reproduced in forms of increasing dilution through Illuminist, Rosicrucian, and Mason ideas all through the centuries. Hints about the inner content of Gothic architecture continue to drip into the European consciousness to the present day, as, for example, in the Cathedrals chapter of P.D. Ouspensky's New Model of the Universe and in Le Mystère des Cathédrales by Fulcanelli. Some significant material appears to have been introduced under the very eyes of official ecclesiastical authority, and even to have been unwittingly given official approval, though the ideas, if presented openly, would probably have produced a reaction of official horror. Thus, the burial of Count Orgaz by El Greco appears to be a devout religious work by a painter of genius, which it undoubtedly is. Its composition can, however, be dissected to show reincarnation concepts, something like the equivalence of conscious and sexual energy and the plurality of eyes in a human personality. These are not concepts which an ordinary clerical sponsor would have approved had he known of them. Perhaps another example of devotional art being not quite what it seems is given by the 14th century fresco The Triumph of St. Thomas, attributed to Andrea da Firenze in Santa Maria Novella in Florence. In this, St. Thomas is the focus of a pictorial allegory on learning. Above his head are the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues. Flanking him are the evangelists, among them St. John and the prophets, including Moses. At the foot, a row of female figures personify the theological sciences and the liberal arts, including arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. St. Thomas is the center of all. He sits enthroned and holding the wisdom of Solomon open at a passage which says, "I prayed and understanding was given to me." But below St. Thomas, and apparently supporting him, there are 3 small figures, all but lost in the decoration. In the flowering of the Middle Ages, in which a detail of the fresco is reproduced, these figures are identified. They turn out to be Lbn Rushd and the 2 arch-heretics Sabellius and Arius. The nature of the structure on which St. Thomas rests can hardly be avoided. Contemporary with Albertus and Aquinas was Roger Bacon, the almost fabulous, miraculous doctor, 1214 to 1292, who wore Arab dress at Oxford and was said to make women of devils and juggle cats into costermongers, a reputation which has gone some way towards concealing one of the greatest of the European intellects and one of the most outstanding figures of all time. Influenced by Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln and First Chancellor of Oxford, Bacon became a Franciscan in 1247. His heterodox views about almost everything early brought him into conflict with his clerical superiors. He had in mind a vast encyclopedia of all knowledge then possessed in the world. once again an echo of the Basra Encyclopedia, and he proposed in a secret letter to the Pope a major institute of learning sponsored by the Church, which would centralize the enterprise. The Pope apparently misunderstood and concluded that the encyclopedia already existed. He expressed interest in it and wanted to see it. Bacon, in a panic, sat down to write it. He had to work without the knowledge of his own superiors, and it is some indication of the quality of his mind that in these circumstances and against the clock, as it were, he produced his three monumental works: the Opus Major, Opus Minor, and Opus Tertium. In these he outlined a scheme for research and experiment in languages, mathematics, optics, alchemy, and astronomy. The Pope, Clement IV, died, however, in 1268, and with him went Bacon's dream of introducing the natural sciences to the universities of Europe. Bacon professed to believe that the totality of human knowledge and possibilities was contained in the Bible. But unlike his contemporaries, he did not believe that the Bible was an open book. To understand it, a certain kind of inner study was necessary, and this involved a knowledge of alchemy, astrology, and magic. Clearly, he was on dangerous ground, and his volatile personality did little to reconcile his views with orthodoxy. He apparently paid for his views with a 14-year period of imprisonment by his own order. He lived to return to Oxford, but died soon afterwards, in 1292. That Bacon, like some others, was engaged in building, secretly, a bridge between the outward form of Christianity and its increasingly dilute inner content is suggested from many circumstances. He cited the wisdom of illumination by the Sufi master and martyr Suhrawardi. The latter had declared that his philosophy was that of the inner teaching of all the ancients, Greek, Persian, and Egyptian. It was the science of light, and through it, man could attain to a state about which he could not normally even dream. Bacon repeated this claim and declared that the same secret had been held by Noah, Abraham, the Chaldean and Egyptian masters, Zoroaster, Pythagoras, Socrates, and the Sufis. Of speculative alchemy, Bacon said, "And because this science is not known to the generality of students, it necessarily follows that they are ignorant of all that depends on it concerning natural things, namely of the generation of animate things, of plants and animals and men, for being ignorant of what comes before, they are necessarily ignorant of what follows." Bacon, like Albertus, was clearly in touch with some genuine esoteric source. Unlike Albertus, he knew Arabic. It seems clear that the source, for both of them, was a Sufi one. Thus, in suggesting that the work of alchemy may produce results other than those apparently being sought, e.g., making gold from lead, he uses an analogy which is in fact a straight lift from a Sufi teaching story. Bacon knew about the right people in the right place at the right time, and implied the prime necessity of a living transmission in all developmental processes. The West of his day and ours could not understand this concept, that a developmental situation has to be of an organic nature and subject to precise laws. He was in consequence regarded as sailing very close indeed to the wind of heresy. Bacon had insights of a peculiar kind, much like those of Michel de Nostradam and the Scottish seer Coinniach Odar, the Brahman seer, centuries later. Bacon described in the plainest possible terms the steamship, the motorcar, the aeroplane, the submarine, and the cantilever bridge. He may also have been hinting at the helicopter. He also described two inventions which are not yet with us. One, a small power source capable of lifting enormous weights. This might perhaps be identified with the so-called Dean device, which the familiar action and reaction laws of forces are inoperative. The theory of this has been the subject of much secret discussion in Europe and America for the last 10 years. Bacon also described a device by which one man can draw 1,000 to himself by violence against their wills and attract other things in like manner. That, so far, has not been discovered in the West, though hints of such a force can be found in certain esoteric traditions. Albertus, Aquinas, Bacon, strange figures indeed, they were associated with a high order of intellect. They made a deep impression on their age, and they contributed material which had a quality of persistence in various guises through many centuries. The early alchemists were probably knowers. They had learned techniques which gave them access to an enhanced level of awareness. From this level, they knew the inner content of religion They discovered that all true religions are one. They experienced the laws of nature, which give rise to form and phenomena. We have suggested that this source of inner development should be identified with initiates serving the directorate and called at this period of time Sufis. This source was concerned with achieving certain evolutionary gains in the 12th and 13th centuries, and it was quite indifferent to whether the cover for its activities was Orthodox Islam or Orthodox Christianity. Men who served this source, whether at first or second remove, found themselves living in two worlds. To declare the truth as they knew it, that there was an inner reality in Islam and Christianity which had been overlaid with dogma and organization, would have seemed apostasy. They had to work in secret, doing what they had to do, but clothing their activity in some form nominally acceptable to the Orthodox Church. They were men who knew they had to build a bridge, but it so happened that bridge building was illegal. The bridge builders had to pretend they were engaged in some other activity, like digging holes in the road. Not unnaturally, the holes were incomprehensible to their contemporaries and have remained largely so ever since. This bridging activity of the early Western alchemists is perhaps seen most clearly in the life of Raymond Lully, whose name was anglicized to Raymond Lully. He succeeded in discharging his mission while remaining on such good terms with both Islam and Christian orthodoxies that he is regarded virtually as a saint by both. Lully was born in Palma, the capital of Majorca, in 1235. The Mediterranean island, held by the Saracens for 700 years, had been reconquered by King James of Aragon 6 years earlier with the aid of the Knights Templar. Tradition has it that Raymond's father was one of the knights who took part in the conquest of Majorca by Rey Jaime. As the young Raymond later became tutor to the king's sons, it would seem that he was persona grata with the Aragon establishment. The association of the Templars with an initiate tradition is well attested, so it seems likely that Raymond Lully was born into a family connected with an esoteric influence. Lully became a master of the Catalan language, and after 9 years' study with a Moorish slave, a master of Arabic as well. He was a poet, philosopher, scientist, and prodigious traveller. He visited the papal courts, was well known in scholarly circles in Paris, Padua, England, and Germany. He visited the cities of North Africa and very probably made less publicized visits to the East as well. Lully was a devout Christian, but whether his devotion was to the orthodoxy which hailed him as its exemplar, or to an inner tradition of esoteric Christianity unsuspected by his peers, is in hindsight a matter of some conjecture. His praise of Los Sufis was one of the stumbling blocks to his canonization, though he is beatified as the blessed Raymond Lully. With the material now available, it is very hard to avoid the suspicion that Lully, like Albertus and Aquinas, had work to do and was very content to accept the label of orthodoxy if and when such cover made his task easier. That he was brilliantly successful in this ambivalence is shown by the fact that he was beatified by Rome. That some later doubts have arisen is suggested by the Church's evident reluctance to accord him full sanctity. Lully taught Arabic in a college of Oriental studies which he founded, close to where Robert Graves now lives. He invented a binary computer, wrote poetry, is credited with inventing the chemical process of rectification by distillation with limestone, and built for himself such a reputation for gentle wisdom, benevolence, and humanity that his life and work were still influencing men like Pico della Mirandola and Leibniz centuries later. Lully's apparent orthodoxy was so complete that a scholar of the caliber of Friedrich here can say of him, "The writings of this remarkable man are still read and commented upon, and not only in his native Spain. Large in mind and generous in spirit, ready to embrace the whole world in his sympathies, Lully held that conversion to Christianity as the sum of earthly truth would inevitably follow from the spread of enlightenment. In fact, that true enlightenment and conversion to Christianity were identical. Faith and reason, mystery and rationality were indissolubly wed. What reasons then exist for supposing that Lully was more than a benevolent original thinker and missionary? Perhaps through his family connection, Lully was in touch with a developmental source from his childhood, but he was 40 before some decisive experience occurred. This would seem to have been an illumination, and is said to have occurred when he climbed Mount Randa, near Palma. This account may indeed be literal, but ascending a mountain is a well-known figure of speech for a less literal kind of ascent. His illumination, wherever it took place, seems to have allowed him to see the laws of nature in operation, and he returned to ordinary consciousness with the idea of encapsulating his insights in a sort of universal machine which would be capable of solving all human problems. That Lully was a genius capable of developing some sort of non-electronic cybernetic computer seems to be admitted. Modern scholars, while remaining a little reserved about computers in the form of talking heads, have accepted completely the idea that Raymond Lully did invent an early cybernetic machine. The machine is mentioned in the History of Cybernetics, and Martin Gardner in Logic, Machines and Diagrams has a chapter on the Ars Magna of Raymond Lully. In Archaeologia 74, Series 2. Mim Dalton describes Lully's computer as a portable dial in the form of a book. A special issue of Studio International in 1968 cites Lully as a pioneer of the computer. Friedrich Heer in The Medieval World describes it thus: "It took the form of what can only be described as a computing engine, which linked up the basic principles or groundwords of all knowledge by a mechanism consisting of concentric circles segmented by radii and of geometric symbols. It seems to have been what might be called a cybernetic machine, prepared to unravel every problem, every science, even faith itself. Here, in rudimentary fashion, were anticipated the great universal formulae of Einstein and Heisenberg, which have provided man with the mathematical keys to the problems of matter, light, energy, and fundamental laws of the cosmos. A miracle machine, or, as later scoffers were to say, a wind machine, tossing empty words about." Leibniz was, however, not among the mockers. Lully's vision came too close to his own dream of finding a universal scientifically viable language which would enlighten all men impartially, the prerequisite of universal peace. This, then, was Lully's attempt to translate an insight into the mechanism of the universe in terms of a philosophical machine. If Lully was an illuminated man, what was the source of his illumination? From many pieces of internal evidence, it appears that Lully was quite simply a Sufi. In him, the strains of alchemy, Saracen science, mathematics, the Kabbalah and Sufi methodology converge in a most striking manner. His book of contemplation was written in Arabic, and his book of the lover and the beloved is admitted to be modeled on esoteric Arab originals. In the Blanquerna, translated into English in 1926, his Sufic affiliation is stated openly. In it, he speaks with admiration of a devotional methodology from the Sufis, whom he describes as religious men among the Saracens. Lully's theory of the descent of man is practically the same as that of Rumi, where categories of stone, plant, animal, man, angel, and God lie along an evolutionary scale. This is remarkable, either as a coincidence or as a suggestion that Lully and Rumi were in correspondence, is even more remarkable when viewed against repeated suggestions in Sufi material that advanced men of a certain tradition in the East transmitted learning by telepathy to men in the West, who were able to sustain the communication. A reference to one example of this is contained in Aflaki, where it is said that the dervish of the West was in communication with Rumi. Was the dervish of the West Raymond Lully? The possibility of such communication and some hints of the method and mechanism will be touched on later when we consider indications of Sufi influence on the modern world. The real nature of Lully's mission and message is a matter of much contention among scholars and religionists. Friedrich Heer notes that Lully had a great appreciation and love of his Islamic adversaries and would have liked to revive the disputations formerly held between representatives of the three great religions. In his Libro del Centi, which appeared in Arabic in 1272, a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian expound the chief points of their respective faiths. In his Liber de Sancto Spiritu, a Greek and a Latin converse in the presence of a Muslim, Lully thought it an advantage for the children of Christian Europe to gain some insight in the Jewish and Islamic worlds. He was convinced that European Christendom needed to be educated afresh so that people's eyes might be open to the beauty of alien worlds. Heer concludes that for Raymond Lully, true enlightenment and conversion to Christianity were identical. Professor Guillaume discusses the Christian and Muslim partisanship for the right to claim Lully's allegiance. he seems to decide on balance in favor of the Arabs. Anyone who considers that Lully was the founder of the School of Oriental Studies, that he wrote and spoke Arabic, and that the great aim of his life was to commend the Christian faith to the Saracens on intellectual grounds, and that he is said to have met a martyr's death preaching to the Arabs of Tunis, will probably feel that to exclude direct Arabian influence from his life is to narrow unduly the range of his overflowing sympathies. Certainly in the theological or rather devotional section of his writings, he borrowed a great deal from the Arabs. His treatise on the 100 Names of God speaks for itself, and in Blanquerna he writes his manifest approval of the marabout or dervish system of exciting devotional ecstatic states by the rhythmical recitation of certain words. A modern Sufi in private correspondence has this to say: modern scholastics seem to be fighting like cat and dog to decide who is a rat. Professor Guillaume, unlike the French scholastics, concedes the Arabic influence, but does not realize that the Saracenic civilization was the cover for a penetration of Sufic ideas into the West. The Catholic religiosity which is read in relation to Raymond Lully need not be taken too seriously. His life appears to parallel very closely that of many Sufis of the Middle East, who had also to cloak heterodox interests in great religiosity. Lully's mission to convert the Saracens to Christianity is in the familiar tradition of the cover story. On his third missionary visit to Africa, Raymond Lully is said to have been seriously injured when he was stoned at Bougie while preaching Christianity to the Arabs. He is said to have died when his ship was in sight of Majorca. Says here, such a man, it will be objected, was a utopian dreamer. He was indeed. But he was also a universal genius, a bold anticipator of the thoughts and problems of the future. Few visitors to Majorca are aware that the vast cathedral of the island's capital is the last resting place of this great European. In his life there seems little to associate with alchemy in the popular sense of the word. But in the next chapter, when we look at the historical record, we shall see that Lully, gold-making and England are related in one of the strangest legends in the whole story of alchemy.